On a quiet evening, Luca Bianca, a former Swiss guard, sat across from a female television reporter for an exclusive interview. Luca had served in the Vatican for nearly a decade, standing guard at Pope Francis' side throughout his years. But today, Luca was not only the Pope's former bodyguard, but also the only one who knew a secret that no one else knew, a secret about a letter that Pope Francis had sent him before his death. This interview, the first time Luca shared what he knew, was not to argue or attack, but to honor a silent choice that Pope Francis had made. Because all these years, Luca had kept silent, because that was part of his duty as a guard, but today, he felt the time had come. The first question from the reporter made Luca slowly think back. Why did Pope Francis choose someone like you? An American, a missionary, someone no one expected. Luca did not answer immediately. He just pulled a sealed envelope from his shirt and placed it on the table. He looked at the reporter, his voice calm but powerful. It was not a choice. It was a memory, and it was never opened while Francis was alive. The reporter was surprised. She asked, "So what was in that envelope?" Luca did not rush to answer. Instead, he just looked at the camera, his eyes cold and steadfast, like the icy peaks of his native Switzerland. It was not a choice. It was a memory. He repeated the sentence. As if he was conveying something extremely important. Time has passed since Pope Francis passed away. And Luca, the silent guard, had stood guard beside him during the last hours of the Pope's life. He was surely the only one who could speak about what happened during those hours. But why had he kept quiet all this time? And why had he decided to share his story with the public today? He paused for a moment and continued to tell the reporter, "I have served Pope Francis for almost a decade. Every time I stood guard beside him, I learned a lesson about silence and respect. But that night, the last night, when I saw him sitting in a chair, not lying on a hospital bed, it was just me and him. We didn't need to say much. We just understood each other." That night, in the Pope's room, there was only the quiet sound of the medical staff's footsteps and the Pope's soft breathing. Luca stood there, in his usual position, with his eyes fixed on the Pope. "Grazie, mio," the Pope whispered, a sentence Luca would never forget. No one said anything else, just the presence of each other. Luca remembered that moment, when one of the Pope's servants handed him a carefully sealed envelope of cream. "This is for you, do not open until there is white smoke," the servant said. Luca felt a strange feeling in his heart, as if there was a responsibility he could not explain. Just a few hours later, at 1:37 a.m., the Pope died. Luca continued to stand in his place, not saying a word, just silence. He did not cry, did not pray, just stood there like a sentinel, keeping his duty. It was not until he returned to his room that he put the envelope in the drawer, keeping it intact like a precious item that he could not open. The whole Vatican, the whole world knew about the event of white smoke rising from the election furnace in the Conclave Council, signaling the appearance of the new Pope. But when the news of the new Pope was announced, Luca could not help but be surprised. The person the Vatican chose as Pope was not someone that anyone could have predicted. Robert Prevost, an American, a missionary priest, was not a prominent figure in the Council of Cardinals. No one thought that someone like him could become Pope. For Luca, this was something unbelievable. Everyone in the Vatican, from the cardinals to the guards, was talking about the election. An American? Never before had a non-European become Pope. But Luca, who had served for nearly a decade at Pope Francis' side, said nothing. He just stood there, listening to the chatter. On this big occasion, Luca did not join in the guards' heated discussions. Instead, he recalled the last words Pope Francis had said to him. "They will ask why I chose an American," the Pope had said. "Let them ask. They did not see what I saw when the floodwaters rose." Luca understood immediately, and he also understood why Pope Francis had chosen someone like Robert Prevost, not because he was prominent or diplomatic, but because he had a special leadership ability, to listen and act without fanfare. The night after the white smoke rose, Luca opened the envelope, and inside was a handwritten letter from Pope Francis. In the letter, Francis recounted a story from many years ago, when he was a young priest, working in a disaster area in Peru. During a great flood, Robert Prevost helped the victims without the help of the press or cameras. He did it only because of his heart and his mission. When Luca read the Pope's words, he understood that Francis' choice was not accidental. It was a deep memory, a memory of silent deeds, that no one but them could understand. And Luca, the guard, was chosen to be the keeper of that memory. After Luca's interview was broadcast, a strong wave of reactions from the public and figures within the Vatican began to appear. People began to understand more clearly why Pope Francis chose Prevost. Not everyone was happy with the revelation, however. Some felt that Luca had overstepped his bounds, but one thing was clear: Luca had done what Pope Francis wanted him to do. He had been a silent witness, keeping his memories and the truth to himself. The next day, Luca stopped giving interviews. He lived a quiet life as before, walking in the Vatican gardens in the late afternoons when no one was watching. But sometimes he carried letters with him, replies to those who had written to him, who felt something change in their hearts after hearing his story. In the end, Luca understood that silence is not weakness. Sometimes, silence is steadfastness and respect. And when he saw Prevost sitting in the Vatican chapel, he knew that he would continue on the path that Pope Francis had laid out. With humility and firm faith, Luca Bianca remembered the day Pope Francis' letter arrived. It was a night unlike any other he had experienced during his years as a guard at the Vatican. But that night, there was an unusual silence, a silence he had never felt before. In the Pope's room, everything was in a state of softness and lightness, as if time had stopped. When Luca entered the room, the Pope was sitting in a large chair, not on a sickbed as people would imagine a dying Pope. A thin blanket covered his knees, and in his hand, the Pope held the rosary, which Luca had seen him carry all this time. The Pope's eyes were dimly looking out the window, where the faint light of the street lamps fell on the ancient walls. He said nothing, but that look, peaceful but full of responsibility, made Luca feel that something very important was about to happen. Pope Francis turned his head slightly and looked at Luca. "Grazia, mio," he whispered. A soft, intimate, but meaningful word. Luca only bowed his head in return, as he had done 1,000 times before. He stood still, keeping his distance, just as he had been trained to do, a Swiss guard, never to disturb, never to disrupt. 2 hours passed in absolute silence, apart from the Pope's breathing and the careful steps of the medical staff. No one spoke, no visitors, no cardinals, no meetings in the dark. That night, it was just Luca and the Pope, like old friends, standing silently together in the solitude of the Vatican. Around midnight, a papal aide entered the room, carrying a cream-colored envelope, carefully sealed with red wax. He approached Luca and placed it in his hand. "This is for you," the servant said softly. "Do not open it until there is white smoke from the election furnace. You will understand." Luca stared at the envelope in his hand, saying nothing, only nodding slightly. He felt a strange sensation, as if a great responsibility was being handed to him. When the servant left, Luca remained standing there, holding the envelope in his hand. He did not open it immediately. Instead, he placed it in a drawer in his room, a place only he knew. He knew that it was something important, and he also knew that it was not always possible to open things like this. A letter from the Pope was more than just a letter. It was a piece of history, a piece of heritage that he could not tear open in a hurry. Little did Luca know that the next few hours would be Pope Francis's last. At 1:37 a.m., the Vatican officially announced that Pope Francis had died. For Luca, there were no waves. He didn't cry, he didn't fret. He just stood there, as he had done for years, steady and unwavering. But that wasn't the end. Because after the Pope's death, everything changed. Luca stood guard in silence, not saying a word. That night, when the white smoke rose from the vault, everything changed. A new Pope was elected. Robert Prevost. An American, a missionary, the last thing anyone in the Vatican had thought of. Only Luca, the guard who had stood guard next to Pope Francis, understood the truth behind this choice. He remembered the quiet conversations with Francis, the signs the Pope had left him, and now the letter from the Pope was more important than ever. Luca slowly walked into his room after the announcement of the new pope. He opened the drawer where he had kept the letter, carefully took out the envelope and opened it. Inside, there were 2 sheets of paper, handwritten, without title or date. The first words Luca read stunned him: "You have only seen me in silence. That is why I trust you to carry this." Luca paused, sighed. He remembered the days when Pope Francis had left the comforts of life in the Vatican Palace to live and work among the poor in faraway lands. He never needed fame, never needed media attention. He just did what needed to be done, in silence and simplicity. That is why Pope Francis chose Robert Prevost, a man with a quiet, unassuming past, but a man who lived and worked with the poor, the people who few people pay attention to. Luke continued reading the letter. Francis recounted an old memory, when he was in Peru in a region devastated by natural disasters. There, during the flood, Robert Prevost did not hesitate to rush into the water, helping the people without support from the media or anyone else. He simply worked for the people, for the faith, for the mission. And in that moment, Pope Francis decided that Robert Prevost was his successor. Francis continued, "They will ask me why I chose an American. Let them ask. They did not see what I saw when the floodwaters rose." Luca recalled these words. And in that moment, he understood that Pope Francis had chosen not just a man capable of leadership, but a man who could understand and face the storms that life brings. Prevost, not for who he was, but for what he had done, silently, unnoticed, Luca sat there, rereading the letter over and over again, the words imprinted in his mind. Pope Francis had left not just a choice, but a living memory of a man who lived for what really mattered. He had chosen not a man for politics or power, but a man who had waded through the flood, who had helped the abandoned without anyone knowing. Luca sat quietly in his room, the letter from Pope Francis in his hand, the words slowly sinking into his mind like a commitment, a responsibility he could not forget. He carefully folded the letter and placed it in a small notebook. This was not a job of simply keeping a secret. It was a responsibility to protect a legacy, a truth that Pope Francis wanted to pass on to the world, something that transcended all the pomp, power, and fame. After that night, Luca shared nothing with anyone. He continued to do his duty in silence, as always. But deep down, he felt that Pope Francis had left him with a greater challenge, that the silence of the guardian, not of cowardice, but of the tenacity to preserve the truth until the time was ripe. And then, that time came, when the new Pope Robert Prevost was elected. Luca felt that everything in the Vatican had changed. Contrary to the expectations of the media and the public, there was no grand applause or loud welcome for a new pope. Instead, there was a strange, insidious silence that permeated the corridors of the Vatican. People were talking about him, but no one really understood why he had been chosen. And Luca, who had been close to Pope Francis all these years, knew that the truth was not a quick event. It was a silent process, and sometimes, silence was the most powerful way. He recalled one night not long after the white smoke had cleared. Luca had stood guard at a window where he could look out onto St. Peter's Square, where crowds had gathered with the flashbulbs of their cell phones, but there was no joy, no jubilation. He felt only emptiness, a restlessness. He knew that everything had happened for a reason, but it was not the time to make it all public. Luca did not participate in the heated discussions in the Legion. He just stood still, keeping his role, as he had always done, but in his heart, the Pope's letter was always a reminder of the importance he had witnessed. He saw in Robert Prevost not only the qualities of a leader, but also the marks of a man who had been in the midst of a storm, who had experienced hardship and never given up. One morning, as Luca was checking the equipment in the warehouse, a young soldier from the Swiss approached him with a worried look on his face. "Luca, what do you think about the new pope being an American?" he asked. "Do you think this will change the way the world views the Vatican?" Luca looked at him, his gaze unwavering. He sighed and replied, "It's not who he is, it's what he does. Don't let his name fool you. Let his actions speak for themselves." The young soldier nodded, but Luca could see the doubt in his eyes. He must not have understood everything Luca had been through in the past years, Luca had nothing more to say. He sensed that things had gone beyond what he could explain in words. Pope Francis had seen things that no one else could see, and that's why he chose Prevost. Not because he was the most influential or the one who could easily attract attention, but because he was the one who could stand firm in the storm without the support of the media or political games. Luca could not forget the moment when Pope Francis took him out into the Vatican gardens a few days before his death. "Luca, sometimes we don't need to say much," he said as they walked along the cobblestone streets in the dim light of dusk. "Silence is not weakness, it is strength. But sometimes, silence can also be a compromise, especially when the truth needs to be shared." Luca stood silently and listened to those words, not knowing that a few days later, those words would become a profound message that he would have to carry out. In the time that followed, Luca could no longer keep silent as he had in the past years. Although he had tried to maintain the loyalty of a sentinel, after the death of Pope Francis, there was a pressure inside him, a feeling that he could no longer stand still. And when others in the Vatican began to question the Pope's choice, Luca felt that he could no longer keep quiet. Late one afternoon, after the white smoke had cleared, Luca decided to participate in an interview. He didn't want to be a sensation, nor did he intend to create controversy. He just wanted to share what he had witnessed, what Pope Francis saw in Robert Prevost. Because it wasn't just a choice, it was an act of love. An act of understanding and commitment. During the interview, when the reporter asked him why the Pope chose an American, Luca just smiled slightly. The Pope doesn't choose a person because of their background. He chooses a person because of their sacrifice and service. That's why he chose Robert Prevost. After the interview, Luca didn't expect any big changes. But a week later, responses started pouring in. People from all over the world, from ordinary lay people to priests, began to share their thoughts. A priest in Nebraska wrote, "I always thought the new pope would be someone who could make a big difference. But after hearing this story, I understand that sometimes, real change comes from people like Prevost, who have been working in the shadows." And a nun in Cork, Ireland, wrote a touching letter, "I met Prevost once during Lent. There were no cameras, no media people, just him and a cup of tea. He sat with a sick person for 3 hours, just holding their hand and listening. Now I understand why the Pope chose him." Luca continues to live a humble life, not giving interviews or public events. He still plays the role of a sentinel, but in his heart, he knows that he has fulfilled a mission that the Pope gave him. Not as a guardian of history, but as a witness to history being made. A few months after the interview, Luca still took regular walks in the Vatican gardens in the afternoons, when the light had begun to soften and the shadows of the trees were long on the stone. He said nothing to anyone, sought no attention. But sometimes he carried letters, responses from people who had written to him. One that he felt was particularly important was from a teacher in Manila who said, "I used to think that humility was not enough strength to lead. But now I'm not so sure." Luca wrote back to her teacher, simply, "Strength does not need to be spoken. Sometimes, it is in silence." When the white smoke rose from the Sistine Chapel chimney, signaling the election of a new pope, the Vatican was abuzz with anticipation. The crowd outside St. Peter's Square erupted in joy, but inside the Swiss Guard barracks, there was only stunned silence. The name that had been whispered through the halls in disbelief was not one anyone had expected: Robert Prevost. An American. A missionary. A man with no ties to the high-ranking circles of the Vatican, no years of service in the Curia, and no previous cardinal status. His election was a complete surprise. Luca Bianca, a former Swiss guard who had served Pope Francis for nearly a decade, stood quietly in the barracks, trying to process what he had just heard. For years, the world had speculated about who might be chosen as the successor to Pope Francis. Some had thought it would be a well-known European cardinal, someone with strong ties to the Vatican's political elite. Others believed the Church might continue to favor someone from within the Curia. But no one, not even the most seasoned observers, had imagined that an American missionary from Chicago, who had spent most of his time serving in the remote corners of Peru, would ascend to the papacy. Luca felt a strange mixture of emotions. The election of a non-European, let alone an American, as Pope was unprecedented. It wasn't just the fact that Robert Prevost was an outsider in terms of papal politics, it was that he was someone who had largely remained out of the public eye. He had not been on any of the church's short lists, and he had certainly not been a prominent figure in any discussions about the future of the papacy. He had lived his life far from the marble halls of the Vatican, in places where cameras and reporters seldom ventured. The senior officers in the Swiss Guard were as stunned as Luca. Sergeant Yulee muttered under his breath, "American? From Chicago?" Another guard whispered, "Mission work in Peru? Not even a cardinal last year." Someone else added, "He wasn't even on the short list." How did this happen? Luca didn't speak. As a Swiss Guard, his training was clear. In moments of uncertainty or surprise, the best thing to do was remain silent and still. But inside, he was unsettled. The world had just changed in a way that no one had predicted. And yet, Luca wasn't entirely surprised. There was something in the way Francis had spoken over the years, something in his quiet humility and deep wisdom, that made this unexpected choice seem, in hindsight, almost inevitable. Luca thought back to the final days of Pope Francis's life, to the moments when Francis had spoken in whispers about what the Church truly needed. There had been no grand speeches, no dramatic moments. Just the quiet presence of a man who had seen much, done much, and knew what the Church needed moving forward. Francis hadn't chosen someone based on diplomacy or political power, he had chosen someone with experience in the trenches, someone who had served the poor and the marginalized, someone who understood the weight of leadership without the trappings of power. When Luca had first heard Prevost's name mentioned, he hadn't fully understood the significance. But now, as the bells tolled across Vatican City and the world prepared to see the new pope, Luca was beginning to grasp the depth of Francis's decision. Prevost wasn't just a missionary. He was someone who had been in the midst of crises, someone who had been on the ground, doing the hard, unseen work of the Church, without seeking recognition or fame. As Luca stood outside the apostolic palace, watching the crowd surge in excitement, he couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. He had seen the Church in its most sacred, most intimate moments. And now, as he watched the world react to the election of Pope Robert Prevost, he realized that this was the kind of pope the world needed. A man who had no interest in politics or grandeur, but who knew what it meant to serve in silence, to be a witness to the suffering and the beauty of the world. It wasn't until later, when Luca finally returned to the barracks after the announcement, that he took the sealed envelope from Pope Francis out of his locker. The letter was still heavy in his hands, and Luca knew that the time had come to open it. It was a message that would change everything, not just for him, but for the Church. He understood now what Francis had meant by choosing a witness, not a politician. The letter confirmed everything Luca had begun to realize. Pope Francis had seen something in Robert Prevost that no one else had. He had seen a man who understood what leadership truly meant, a man who had been forged in the fire of real, everyday challenges, rather than the artificial battles of power and politics. In the days that followed, Luca remained silent. But as the weeks passed and the media continued to question the unexpected choice of Pope Prevost, Luca knew that the Church had taken a bold step in a new direction, and he couldn't help but feel proud to have witnessed history in the making. Pope Francis had never been one for grand speeches or power plays. His leadership was not rooted in charm or diplomacy, but in a quiet, unwavering commitment to the core values of the Church, humility, service, and a deep understanding of what it meant to be a shepherd. When he chose Robert Prevost as his successor, Francis was not concerned with political calculations or popularity. He was looking for something deeper, someone who could lead with the same authenticity, compassion, and selflessness that he had strived to embody throughout his papacy. Francis had always been a pope of the people, someone who refused the luxuries of the Vatican and chose instead to walk among the poor and the marginalized. He had lived through adversity, not as a distant observer but as someone who had stood in the trenches, shoulder to shoulder with those who were suffering. Whether it was visiting hospitals, washing the feet of prisoners, or standing in solidarity with communities torn apart by war or poverty, Francis had consistently chosen to lead by example, not by command. In Robert Prevost, Francis saw someone who had already lived that kind of life. A man who had spent years working in remote, underserved areas in Peru, dealing with the hardships that many in the Vatican would never fully understand. Prevost was not a man of flashy accomplishments or media-friendly charisma. He wasn't a part of the Vatican's political circles. Nor had he ever sought fame. But that, to Francis, was precisely why he was the right choice. Prevost had the kind of humility and experience that would serve the church far better than any polished politician or diplomat. Francis had always understood the power of silence. In his own way, he had built a papacy on a foundation of quiet, often unseen service. It wasn't that he lacked words, it was that he used them sparingly, and when he spoke, it was with a clarity that cut through the noise of the world. He knew that leadership in the modern world was often loud, competitive, and brash, but he believed that true leadership required something different. It required patience, empathy, and the ability to listen more than to speak, and so, when the time came to choose his successor, Francis chose not for outward success or political maneuvering, but for someone who had already demonstrated these qualities in their purest form. Robert Prevost had lived a life of service, had faced the kind of adversity that shaped a leader, and had shown the humility to carry out his work without seeking recognition. Francis saw in him a leader who would guide the church through turbulent times, not by speaking over the noise, but by embodying the quiet strength that the world so desperately needed. For Luca Bianca, the message that Pope Francis had chosen Robert Prevost wasn't just about the election itself. It was about something far deeper, something that transcended the moment of the conclave and reached into the heart of what it meant to be a witness. Luca had never been chosen because of his power or his position within the Vatican. As a Swiss guard, his role was not to influence or make decisions, it was to observe, to protect, and to stand silently in service to the Pope. He was a man of action, not words, and his duty was to remain unseen, to bear witness to history without drawing attention to himself. It was a role that required immense discipline and understanding, qualities that Luca had honed over the years, but Pope Francis had seen something in Luca that made him the perfect person to carry forward a message that needed to be passed on silently and with great care. Luca wasn't just another guard, he was a witness to something extraordinary. His presence in the room, his ability to stand in silence and bear witness to the Pope's final days, made him the ideal custodian of Francis's legacy. In that final letter that Pope Francis had given him, Luca was entrusted not with power, but with memory. The Pope's choice wasn't just about who would lead next, it was about making sure that the story of the Church's true mission, its true purpose, would not be lost. The letter that Pope Francis had given to Luca, sealed and entrusted to him with such gravity, was a testament to the importance of silence in preserving truth. It was a reminder that there were times when speaking out was not the answer, when it was more important to simply bear witness, to hold the truth in one's heart and wait for the right moment to share it. For Luca, this was not just a duty, it was a burden, one that he would carry for as long as he lived. In the weeks following Pope Francis's death and the election of Pope Prevost, Luca felt the weight of his responsibility more than ever. He had been given a rare opportunity to be part of something monumental, but it was not for the purpose of self-aggrandizement. It was for something much greater, to be the silent witness to a decision that would change the future of the Church. He knew that the time would come when the world would need to understand why Francis had chosen Prevost, and it would be his job to explain that choice, not in words, but in the way he lived and the way he carried forward the memory of what Francis had done. Francis's letter was not just about the past. It was about the future. It was a call to those who would come after to remember the importance of service, humility, and the quiet strength that comes from facing adversity. Luca understood that the Pope had chosen him because he knew how to remain silent, how to bear witness without drawing attention to himself. This was the kind of leadership that Francis had envisioned for the Church, one that did not seek the spotlight but instead shone through its actions. Luca often reflected on the words of the Pope in his final days, how Francis had spoken of silence as both strength and burden. It was a powerful reminder that in the moments when the world demands the loudest voices, the true leaders are often the ones who remain still, who listen rather than speak, and who act without the need for recognition. Luca knew that his role, as a guard, was not just to protect the Pope physically, but to protect the legacy of the kind of leadership that Pope Francis had embodied. A leadership that was not built on power, but on service, on humility, and on the quiet understanding that true authority comes not from the ability to command, but from the ability to serve. As Luca moved forward, carrying the memory of that letter and the vision it contained, he knew that his silence would speak louder than any words ever could. He had been entrusted with the truth, and in time, the world would come to understand why Francis had made the choices he did, and why Robert Prevost was the right man to carry the torch forward. Until then, Luca would remain a silent witness, honoring his duty and keeping the memory of the Pope's vision alive. The interview that Luca Bianca gave in the days following Pope Francis's death created a ripple that reverberated across the world. What had been a quiet, almost hidden choice, the selection of Robert Prevost as Pope, was suddenly thrust into the spotlight, forcing people to grapple with an unexpected decision that would shape the future of the Church. Luca's words, spoken in a calm and measured tone, offered a glimpse into the mind of Pope Francis and helped the world understand why the Pope had made the choices he did. At first, the reaction was mixed. There were many who felt a sense of relief, understanding, or even pride. For those who had questioned the election of Prevost, Luca's reflections provided clarity. The Pope had chosen a man who was not part of the Vatican's elite, not a polished diplomat, and not someone seeking fame or power. Instead, Robert Prevost was a man who had lived out the true mission of the Church, serving those who needed it most, often in silence and obscurity. Luca's words illuminated this point, showing that the decision was not about politics or power struggles, but about humility, sacrifice, and service. People from across the globe began to reach out, sending messages of gratitude to Luca for shedding light on why Pope Francis had chosen such an unexpected figure. An anonymous email from a nun in rural India spoke of how she had witnessed Prevost's work in the slums, where he had quietly served without any fanfare. "Your words made me understand why Francis chose him," the nun wrote. "It's not about where you come from or what position you hold. It's about what you've done for others, without anyone knowing or caring." A priest from Brazil wrote a thoughtful response. "I always thought the papacy needed someone with more influence, someone with political ties. But now I see that Francis chose a man who truly understands what it means to lead by example." In Europe, especially in Italy, the reaction was more divided. Some embraced Luca's message, understanding that Pope Francis had made a profound decision, rooted not in conventional thinking but in a deeper understanding of the Church's true mission. Others, however, felt uneasy about the decision to break the silence. They questioned whether it was appropriate for Luca to speak out, fearing that his words might undermine the sanctity of the papacy and the Church's ability to maintain a sense of mystery and reverence. There were criticisms, too, from some corners of the Vatican. Certain members of the clergy, particularly those aligned with the more traditional factions of the Church, were less than pleased with Luca's decision to publicly discuss the letter he had been entrusted with. "A guard should remain silent," one cardinal said privately. "His oath is to protect, not to reveal." Still, despite the mixed reactions, it became clear that Luca's words had resonated with many. His message had an authenticity that could not be denied. People saw not just a former Swiss guard speaking out, but someone who had stood at the side of Pope Francis during his most crucial moments. His testimony provided insight into the Pope's heart and vision, something that, despite its simplicity, was more powerful than any political argument or theological debate. As the public reaction to his interview unfolded, Luca took time to reflect on his own life, his years spent guarding Pope Francis, and the bond of trust that had formed between them. He had always understood the importance of his role, but it was only now, in the silence that followed the broadcast, that he began to fully grasp the depth of that responsibility. In the years he had spent as a Swiss guard, Luca had stood watch over many popes and witnessed moments of great spiritual significance. But with Pope Francis, it was different. There was a quiet intimacy in the way Francis led. It was not about grandeur or ceremony, but about the small, seemingly insignificant moments that defined the man. Francis had never been one to demand attention or praise. Instead, he led with actions, quiet, consistent, and often unnoticed by the world at large. Luca thought back to the times he had spent alone with Pope Francis, standing at his post just outside the Pope's private chambers, watching as the Pope moved about the Vatican with a humility that few could truly understand. There were no grand speeches, no dramatic gestures. Just a man who would often stop in the hallways, reach out, and place a gentle hand on Luca's shoulder. "You do good work, Luca," he would say, always with that same tired smile that spoke volumes more than words could. In those quiet moments, Luca had learned more than any formal training could have taught him. He had learned the power of presence. The weight of standing in silence, of being fully present without speaking, was something Francis had exemplified in everything he did. It wasn't just about being still, it was about being attentive to what was happening around you and understanding that sometimes, the most important work is done without fanfare. The Pope's leadership had always been one of service, and in serving, Francis had demonstrated what true strength looked like. Luca had witnessed the Pope's struggles, his quiet sorrow, and his unyielding commitment to the poor and the oppressed. The strength of Francis was not in his words, but in the example he set, a life lived in constant service, a life that inspired not through power, but through humility. Luca also reflected on the burden of silence, a burden that had become his own since receiving the letter from Pope Francis. The weight of carrying a secret, of holding on to a memory that was not his to share, was something he had never expected to carry. He had been entrusted with a truth that was not for the world to know, not until the right time. And that time had come, but even now, as he sat alone in his quarters, Luca wondered if he had done the right thing in speaking out. His role, as he had always understood it, was to observe and protect, not to reveal. Yet, he knew that Pope Francis had chosen him for a reason, because he understood the importance of silence. And sometimes, as Francis had shown, silence was not a sign of weakness but of great strength. It was a silence that carried within it the weight of a message far greater than any words could convey. Luca's decision to speak, to break his silence, was not one made lightly. It was a choice that came with its own set of challenges, but it was also one that was driven by the deep trust that had been built between him and the Pope. He wasn't speaking for himself, he wasn't speaking to seek attention or fame. He was speaking because he understood that the world needed to hear what Pope Francis had seen in Robert Prevost, the quiet strength, the humility, and the commitment to serving those in need. As Luca sat in his room, reflecting on the weight of his duty, he knew that silence was still a part of his life. But now, it was a silence that carried meaning, a silence that could speak volumes without uttering a word. He had been a witness to something profound, and he would carry that witness with him for the rest of his life, speaking when necessary, but always with the understanding that sometimes the most powerful words are the ones left unspoken. Luca's interview ignited a quiet but powerful shift within the Vatican. As the world began to understand the true reasons behind Pope Francis's choice of Robert Prevost, it became clear that the decision was rooted in humility and service, not politics. Prevost's papacy, marked by his simple yet profound leadership, started to influence the Church in ways that transcended traditional expectations. His choices began to reshape Vatican priorities, moving away from political maneuvering to a focus on genuine service and compassion. In a final, quiet act of respect, Luca returned the rosary Pope Francis had given him, a deeply personal gift that symbolized their bond. He placed it on the chapel rail as a gesture of memory. Not for public display, but as a reminder of his role, not as a spokesman, but as a silent witness to the profound history unfolding before him. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to hit like and share it. Subscribe to our channel for more inspiring videos. Thanks again and see you in the next one.